there was always, I guess, people questioned whether or not Colorado deserved to share that national championship that year. And you know why? Because the officials, the day of the game, allowed Colorado a 5th down, which gave them the go-ahead win for that game. Do you remember that?
Yep.
And so to this day forward, actually Bill McCartney said years afterwards, 4 years later when he was with the Promise Keepers, that was certainly one moment that he regretted as a coach, because he knew it cast a cloud of credibility on the national championship that Colorado shared that year with Georgia. Why do I say that? Because elections matter. And they're a heck of a lot more important than someone who becomes the national championship for college football, right?
Yes.
Certainly does to me, and I hope it does to everyone in here. And yet continuously, I'm amazed at how we have people, and I saw it here in the halls of this Capitol, and you probably hear from folks back home, who continue to maintain that there's no problems with the credibility of the election system we have here in our state. And the credibility could be restored very quickly, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that. But I also want to give you history, because one of the things I hear oftentimes, and I heard it debated many times when I was here, is you can't prove there's any evidence of voter fraud in the state of Missouri. Now, do y'all remember Harry Truman and Tom Pendergast?
Yeah.
And do you remember what happened in the election in 1936, or do you remember the history of that? Okay, I mean, I wasn't alive then, so I can't say that I remember. But if you go back and study history, what did we learn about that election? You had the political machinery in that Democrat primary of Kansas City versus St. Louis. And you had almost 120,000 votes for the candidate that Harry Truman was up against, and Harry Truman in St. Louis got about 5,000 votes. However, the Pendergast machine did a lot better in Kansas City, and they got about 137,000 votes, and the guy he was running against from St. Louis got about 1,500 votes. And what happened after that? That was the beginning of the downfall of the Pendergast machine. And soon thereafter, we got statewide voter registration. It was no longer up to the local municipality, and things began to change when it came to making sure that we have credibility in our elections. And I've said oftentimes, had photo IDs been commonplace in our society back then, I think they probably would have adopted that as far as the verification process when somebody showed up to vote. But before I get into that, I want to talk a little bit about what matters when you register to vote. Oh, and by the way, I almost forgot. How many of you are familiar with UMB Bank? I don't know if you know of one of Crosby Kemper, who'd been the president for a long time, just passed away last week. So, anyway. But the reason I mention that is he ran for the Senate in 1962. And you know what they credit, he ran the Republican ticket, to the reason he lost in that general election was voter fraud in the city of St. Louis. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Acorn and the problem we have with Acorn and their organization. Even if they're not a organization by name, we know they're still out there doing the things they did before. But verification when you register to vote is so important. And one of the things that I believe we need to implement here in our state, prove you're a citizen. Isn't that a simple way to make sure you are a voter? Is we want to make sure you're a citizen. And right now, the documentation you have to put forth in order to be able to do that doesn't necessarily have to show your proof of citizenship. And what's interesting, the other party will fight you even on verification of citizenship. And you know how I know that? I filed the bill, and they fought me on it. And one of the things they said was that if you did gain your citizenship and you did happen to lose your papers, that would be a disservice to the person who had gained their citizenship from another country. Well, if you talk to anybody who's ever become a citizen from another country, what's one of the first things they'll tell you? They treasure those papers. They don't lose them. They're almost as sacred to them as the opportunity to be able to vote, right? And so we ought to be able to do that here in our own state. And yet that was something that Secretary Carnahan opposed, and I know that our current Secretary of State, Jason Kander, opposes. And so it's important that we move forward in doing those common sense things. And by the way, you'll hear people who are in elected office, oh, I don't oppose that. Well, by virtue of your inaction, it shows you're not for something. So don't ever be fooled by those things. But let's also look at ACORN and why it's important that we do a better job of verifying who is a voter. Which, by the way, I want to mention real quick. I don't know if you saw our current Secretary of State just came up with online voter registration. Now listen, we should always be for allowing the greatest amount of access to people being able to vote as possible. Because that's something that our founding fathers understood, right? But we also ought to be about verifying the integrity of the process so nobody ever has any doubt about when that vote is cast that their vote is going to count. And they both equally matter. And the reason I say that is if you go and look at the registration process, the reason that some of the county clerks have an issue with it is what? Has anybody been studying this? The signature process. Yes. So we're going. There she is. It's the signature process, isn't it? Because you can literally take a mouse and scroll in your signature and send that in to the Secretary of State, and then they'll send that back to the local election officials. Now, I don't know about you, but when somebody shows up to vote and they sign their name and pen versus what you use with the computer on the internet, those are going to be two significantly different signatures. But even greater, I just saw Ron walk in, is the fact when you have the initiative petition process and people sign their names on initiative petition and you try to verify that signature with the signature that they used when they registered to vote, can you imagine how quickly organizations like ACORN can take advantage of a process like this? It's a real problem. And it's not about we don't want to get people registered to vote. If you're 18, you're a citizen of this nation, you ought to be able to vote, right? But if you're like me, I just want to make sure you're a credible, legitimate voter. That's all. And so now we have the opportunity to be able to flood more voter registrations to the local county officials that'll be much harder to be able to verify that person's a legitimate voter. And the reason I bring up ACORN, you can go back to the mid-'80s. They have been convicted time and time again, them and their workers, for voter registration fraud. Matter of fact, one of the most famous stories is back in the mayoral 2001 primary of St. Louis. In that particular primary, before the primary was held, there was an ACORN worker. Her name was Nona Risa Montgomery. Does anybody remember the story? She went to a local fast food restaurant with a group of ACORN workers. They took an old voter registration roll, and that's what they used to sign the voter registration cards that they sent in. Now, how many of those are going through unnoticed that people aren't catching? And yet, when you say there's a problem with fraud in the state of Missouri, you continually get rebuffed and say it doesn't happen. Well, I remember being on the floor of the House and I'd say, prove to me an instance of fraud. Well, do y'all remember what happened in Kansas City 3 years ago in the Democrat primary? There's a state rep. Listen, he's a nice guy, I know him. I served with him for 2 years. But John Rizzo, and you can go to the Kansas City Star, this is anything that's not been out in the public. He had 2 of his relatives cast a vote for him in the primary that were not registered voters in the area they were voting in. You know how many votes he won that primary by? 1 vote. And they had 2 relatives they found who cast fraudulent votes. 1 vote does matter, and 1 fraudulent voter registration vote matters too. That's why I take it seriously, and I know everybody in this room takes it seriously, because it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. Unfortunately, when people have the opportunity for power, sometimes they'll make wrong decisions, won't they? And that's why you have to have integrity in the process. And so it just makes common sense to do a better job to verify when people register to vote. But then secondly, we need to do a better job of cleaning up the voter rolls. Matter of fact, one of the things when I was running for Secretary of State 2 years ago was Secretary of State from Kansas, Chris Kobach. They have the opportunity to take the voter rolls and exchange them between the states. The one state that he was not able to exchange with was right here in Missouri with Secretary Carnahan at the time. And all they do is they check and see if somebody moved from one state to the other. Usually the Social Security number is the verifying, identities, because if you have more than one John Smith, it could easily get confused. And then if they know they moved, then they go ahead, they contact the other Secretary of State so they can take them off their rolls. It's a normal process. He wasn't able to do that here in the state of Missouri. Now, I don't know if Secretary of State Cantor has done that or not, but I hope that he has. And you ought to be contacting him, making sure he's doing that. Because here's what happens when you have voter rolls that have more voters, have illegitimate voters on it than actual people who should be voting. For example, Reynolds County. There was a time when they had 25% more people on the voter rolls than people that lived in the county. Okay? That's a problem. Because all it takes, and this has been done for years, going all the way back to the Pendergrast era, especially in the bigger cities. They load them up in a car, they go from polling location to polling location, and they get out and they go vote underneath a different identity. Because what do you need in the state of Missouri in order to be able to vote right now? Use your utility statement. That's right. That is, in my opinion, very easily. It's very easy to fake a utility statement. It's a lot harder to fake your actual photo. And here's what is interesting to me, is that in 2005, there was a U.S. Election Commission put forth. And former President Jimmy Carter and former U.S. Secretary of State James Baker chaired this election commission. And you know what they came to the conclusion of? And it's in this report, it's about 113 pages long. They said we need to have photo ID in our nation to protect our votes. Even former Jimmy Carter, and I'm a strong Republican who never would have ever cast a vote for him. I got in trouble from my grandma when I was younger because I was saying things that weren't kind towards him when he was president, okay? It's the truth. She told me to respect my president. I understood that from then forward. But I was a little conservative from day one. So, anyway. But nonetheless, even Jimmy Carter understood the best way to protect your vote is to have a photo ID with it. It's just plain common sense. We shouldn't have to defend this. And one of the reasons I hear oftentimes, for example, you hear the word racism used, or you hear the word, it's an extreme inconvenience for somebody to have to go and get a photo ID if they don't already possess one. Now my question to that, if they take the time, the 13-hour time period between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. to go stand in line to vote, then why wouldn't they want to go make sure they get a photo to make sure the vote they cast is protected? I mean, that's just common sense. It's not an inconvenience to make sure that your vote's protected. Matter of fact, the states where they've implemented photo ID, and you'll hear, well, you won't have greatest election voter turnout. They've actually increased their voter turnout. I believe it's the states of Nebraska, Indiana, and Georgia. They either maintained the voter turnout or it increased. And here's the reason I think it increased in the states where it went up, is because, for example, for many years now, people have had doubts about the integrity of the election process. Well, guess what happens when you begin to believe your vote doesn't count? You stop voting. So what's one of the best ways to increase voter turnout? Make sure that people believe in the credibility of the process, the integrity of the process. Then they'll be willing to show up and vote. That's just plain common sense. So that's one thing I want to mention. Then also, look at my notes here. Okay, talk about the rules, talk voter ID. I think I covered it here. Wow. Want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Oh, I know. There's two things I did forget. Poll watchers. Folks, if there's an issue, and you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, it's very hard. Not only do you need election judges for each party at that ballot box on election day, but you also need to have poll watchers. How many people are on the central committee back home? How many of you know it is our responsibility on the central committee back home to make sure we have a poll watcher at each location? It's absolutely integral to the process, because here's what happens. When people know that their votes that they're casting are being watched, if they're thinking about doing something that's fraudulent and casting a vote, they might think twice when they see somebody's watching the votes they're casting. It's important. So I want to mention that. Then I also want to mention there's an issue that may be on the ballot next year. And this is the early voting proposal that Governor Nixon, Attorney General Chris Koster, and I know Secretary Kander supports. And that is the idea that you have no excuse early absentee voting. Now, here's what's interesting about that. They've never shown it actually increases voter turnout. And actually, if you go back and study it, it actually increases the potential for fraud. Because the one thing right now, when you have to go forward and put forth a reason, is you sign an affidavit. So if they find out for any reason that you are not being truthful, then they can come after you. But when there's no excuses, there's no accountability, there's no credibility, you're literally having to sign up and say, "This, I am who I say I am." And it's a lot easier to catch up with somebody in that instance than it is when there's no excuse. Because that's one of the things, for example, you hear, well, give me an example where somebody has committed voter fraud. Well, just remember, right now with the system as we have it, when you go in and cast that vote and you leave the polling location, the likelihood of them ever catching up with you 30 days later or 15 days later, whatever that time period is when they figured out fraudulent votes were cast, is almost non-existent. You can't catch these folks. Sorry about that, I need to turn my phone down. But those are some common sense things that we can do to protect the election process. And so I would encourage everyone, don't forget about it. It's an easy issue because we get busy in our daily lives to kind of forget about it. And unfortunately, we've had Secretary of States since Matt Blunt who did fight to put forth integrity in the process. As a matter of fact, I was there in St. Louis when he put forth basically a group from the Secretary of State's office went over for that primary in 2001, and we watched the polls and we studied the process. Because if you remember what happened in 2000 in the city of St. Louis, they held the polls open. And if you remember, the document that they filed in the courts in St. Louis and the documents they filed in Kansas City in federal courts were almost verbatim the exact same document. They had it planned ahead already. Okay, go ahead. Oh, I meant to mention that. I'm so glad you missed that. Yeah, paper ballot. That, we should never be arguing about whether or not you have a paper ballot trail to follow the votes that you cast. Matter of fact, I think if you have any county clerk that doesn't have a paper ballot to follow, they need to be getting some phone calls and telling them to change the system they've implemented in that local county. Because it's absolute, because if you don't have a paper ballot, how are you going to document the actual vote of people who vote? Go ahead.
My understanding, and maybe someone else can help me on this, was that with the electronic ballot, the company that owns the voting machine owns the rights to those. They destroy those results like 21 months afterwards. So the ability of the citizen to actually say, wait, you need a recount is very, very limited because A, you don't have access to them, and B, the trail is gone. And how many times have we seen an issue of lack of integrity show up more than 22 months after it happened? So maybe I'm wrong with that, but
I'd have to research. I do know I talked to Secretary of State Chris Kobach about the issue because there was concerns in the last election that the company was outside of the U.S. And this is a guy who has more credibility. He actually said that he couldn't find anything to validate the concerns. However, even here in Missouri, there was an election that was in that basically they went back and they decided they were going to do a recount. It's one of our courthouses down in the Boot Hill area. I believe it was Mississippi County. In between the recount and when they had the ballot boxes stored away safe in the county courthouse, guess what happened? Courthouse burned down. So now, if they're willing to go to the I guess extreme of burning down a courthouse, which common sense tells you that probably just wasn't a coincidence, how much easier is it going to be if you have something on an electronic disc to be able to go? Right.
Well, you know, I think with all of the NSA revelations, we're all pretty convinced that there is the technology to tap, even from a distance,
Mhm.
almost any electronic. They can turn your iPhone on anytime they want to.
Well, and you know what's
And so-
interesting is I had a chance to hear former Attorney General John Ashcroft, and he said all the things you read in the spy books are basically true.
Or they will be.
So, just in respect, John.
Can you recommend a bill number yet this year that we can support that has a good comprehensive coverage of all these issues like the Kansas bill?
I have not. I talked to Stan Cox last week. I know that he's moving forward on doing some things. I haven't talked to Sue Inlicker in the House to see what they're doing, but certainly
There will
there's
be one.
because we need to get voter ID on the ballot this next election.
Well,
Absolutely
and
has
all
to
these other
happen.
things too. Proof of
Yes.
citizenship. The
Right.
SAFE Act in Kansas is a great model.
Absolutely, and as you'll notice, I'm forgetting the name of the federal agency, but they're already doing all they can to thwart Chris Kobach's efforts by not giving him the information he needs to be able to uphold that.
One of the things that Kobach can document now is that the claims that there would be 8% of the people without a photo ID,
Is
they've
wrong.
had enough elections now that the number of people showing up without a photo ID is like 1/10 of 1%.
Right, and almost all of them, and you get to cast a provisional ballot in those cases anyway.
Exactly.
And so that's an important point not to forget. Yes.
Were there any prosecutions in these fraudulent cases that you told us about?
With Acorn, absolutely. They went to the federal courts with John Rizzo. That was prosecuted as well. Absolutely.
His place?
He did not. He would not step down. That's the interesting part. And by the way, when I was on the county trail, I met another county clerk over near the St. Louis area. And one of the things they mentioned to me was they actually had the feds show up. And I always thought this was a funny story. They had a person who cast 2 votes. One in Cook County, Illinois. Scratch your head a little bit. Where's our president from? And in their county. Now the reason they can trace that is that you had a person who basically registered under the same name and voted twice. That's easy to catch up with. Normally what happens is they're assuming someone else's identity. And that's very hard to catch up with. Of course, you remember Eric Holder claimed there was no voter fraud, and what happened in that one famous video where they were going to give the ballot to that young man. I think he was with the Eric O'Keefe's organization and vote in his name. Of course, he was smart enough not to take the ballot, but at the same time, the United States Attorney General almost had voter fraud committed in his name, and it was proved by virtue of video, and he said there was no voter fraud. So, yes.
Why was the case about Russo, why didn't the legislature act to get him out?
I cannot answer that
And
because,
and if not them, who?
right, to me, it would be something that certainly could be challenged in the courts, for sure, but you'd have to speak to the Speaker's office and the Ethics Committee as to why they chose not to do that. Because he did get reelected after that in an election following that in 2012. Because he was elected in 10 the first time, 2012. But to me, you need to step down. There should be absolutely no reason why you would continue to keep that position.
And if you didn't, then the rest of you should have taken care of it.
Right. So, and that's a heavily Democrat district. Listen, probably most likely in that district, the Democrats going to win every time. But nonetheless, it brings, you have to have credibility in the process. Yes, sir.
That was a Democratic primary.
Right, and that's what I'm saying.
So
Democrat primary.
The other Democrat was let out
Royster.
of the job.
Right, that was Royster who was, absolutely. And my point is, in the general, Democrats most likely going to win that district. But nonetheless, you still want credibility in the primary and the general. It doesn't matter. Okay.
Well, that might be a perfect example where we assume the Democrat is going to win the district. So how many borderline and other people stay home and just don't vote because they've heard that message so often?
Mhm.
I wonder, sometimes I think we shoot ourselves in the foot by.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point. Because when you're seeing 89% voting one way, it does make you scratch your head a little. So, yes.
Do we have numbers to say how many times this has happened, voter fraud has happened with Democrats versus with Republicans?
No, I'm not aware of anything. I'm sure you could do it. I haven't actually seen that put together.
I think that would be an interesting thing to show.
Although I always,
I mean, we walk in the same circles, so we're going to talk about the other side, right? But
well, and what I would always say for the person who's independent, I don't make it a party issue, it's a voter issue.
right, oh, sure.
Because the voter needs to believe that there's credibility even if they haven't claimed a party. And that's why I never articulated in the form of the party, because it's not a one-party issue. It's a two-party issue. You've had Republicans convicted of voter fraud. So I want to make sure both parties, any party, is held accountable.
But when they claim things like racism, it's kind of nice to be able to have something that, some knife to jab back at.
Yes. Yeah.
Just listening to the prosecution part of it, I mean, if you don't, you know, if the person doesn't get held responsible for their actions, I mean, what's the point? I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's very frustrating as a voter
It
to
is.
think, okay, well, you did something wrong, but you're not being held accountable for it, so why bother to find out they did something wrong?
Yes.
I mean, it's frustrating. I mean, if we don't go to the end of the story and finish this and start punishing people, then it won't stop.
Right. No, I have no disagreement with you on that. So, however, you've got to get the people in the positions that will do that too.
And that is true.
And that's part of the problem. Yes.
One thing I'm concerned about, I mean, I support the photo ID, but I
Yes.
do have a concern.
Okay.
How would we protect it from being like one number per person, database collecting us, turning into this monster to identify me to that vote?
Like separating that from a national registry.
Right, and that's where it has to be done.
Not using my social security number.
Right, and that's what has to be done state by state. For example, I have my driver's license, I don't have my social security number on it. That's normally the most accepted way to get photo ID would be through your driver's license, and you can get the option of not using social security number, which I did years ago. I took that off of mine. And so and also there's been provisions in all the bills that went forward that make sure that if you're, and I'm a little rusty on this, but they basically protect you by age. If you're born in a time period where a birth certificate was not necessarily available, then you're protected as well, as far as, you know, making sure that you have your photo ID, et cetera. So there are people who are automatically grandfathered in. It's the voters going forward you want to make sure as we continue to protect. And so there are some common sense protections in there to help as well. Yes.
She brought up that point. I was going to say also, I mean, you protect your photo ID by each precinct with your address as you initially get your ballot enabled.
Right.
That's duplicates are not very highly unlikely.
And the problem is that these are individual stories, but I did meet a person or two during the campaign who told me I went in to vote and somebody had already cast a vote in my name. So what do you do then? There's nothing they can do at that point. So, yes.
Don't you have to send a notice to the Secretary of State if you have moved, instead of just to your local clerk?
Normally, if you go to county clerk and you do that, then normally they send in the paperwork to the other county. You're supposed to, you do have personal responsibility to do that, but a lot of people don't do it. It depends upon the county local election official. And the biggest problem the election officials have is the Help America Voter Act. That required them to keep people on the rolls for year after year after year. And so that's another problem that they have, that their hands are tied essentially because, you know, clearly because of federal elections, you're always going to have federal oversight in those major elections like that. So it's an issue. But that's where it takes the vigilance of a local election official to do all they can, and that's why you work with your county committees to watch the people who are casting the votes. You do all you can to help make sure you yourself protect the integrity of that process. So, yes.
So, considering the scenario you put there, that you go in to vote, and somebody's voted in your place, and you're saying there's nothing you can do at that point, there must be some recourse or something that we need to have in place. I know when you're a judge, you can call the Republican Party headquarters that has
Right.
persons overseeing and report those things.
Right.
The only thing I have heard is that they don't get involved in the county.
And like I said, you know, those are two anecdotal stories I heard. All I know is that when that happened, they felt helpless to be able to do anything themselves. And that's why photo ID prevents major, I mean, that takes care of a lot of those issues at that point very quickly.
But what I'm saying is the judge there
Yes,
should have been the one that tried to do something on behalf of the
sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
Am
I've never walked through that process, but you're probably right. You have to go to your local county clerk, for example, your election board, notify them, because the election judge would find out that day, and then work it through the process. I've never worked through that entirely, but at some point, I would say if you've raised enough. And then the other thing is they're going to go back and say, would that vote have had an outcome? Would it impact the election, et cetera, how far they follow it? But still, that's why the common sense solution is put photo ID at the beginning. Make sure you do a better job of verifying who's registered to vote, those types of common sense measures. And then you can weed out a lot of those problems very quickly. Yes?
What, and you may not want to answer this, but what about our military, the ability to get our military their ballots and get them back in time to be counted? Does that have any tie into what you're talking about? That's a big issue, I think.
Yes, and that was one that I was continually had to fight a year and a half ago, was that somehow I was against military people from being able to vote, because we were also wanting to make sure that if somebody sends an absentee ballots, one of the things they've also done, especially in these early voting states, where party workers can go and work, house to house, they've been known to get these absentee ballots, fill them out, and send them in. Not uncommon. So, for example, in that case, you actually work with the Department of Defense as a local Secretary of State for your state, and you work with them to streamline that process. And I think there's a lot of things they can do in order to be able to make that process better, because you want everybody who serves, overseas, especially wherever they're at, they need to make sure the votes are counted. As you know, oftentimes that has not happened. And I will say, Secretary Kobach mentioned that he felt like that working with the Obama administration at that time, that was not an issue they had actually, that they were working with them to make sure that happened. But again, that's up to your state election official. Normally that's your Secretary of State to make sure they're protecting the military men and women of their state and making sure those votes get counted. Yes.
There have been several people gone to prison this time because of the voter fraud in this last election. Is there anybody keeping track of how many? I want that list.
We were just kind of asked that question earlier. I'm not aware of any, but I'm sure there's probably True the Vote or somebody like that is beginning to keep that information. I'd be very surprised if they are not. Dave?
To answer that, I'm a member of the reserves. My unit is in Kansas City area. I received probably 3 emails before the last presidential election, encouraging me to vote. I didn't go through the process, even though I wanted to, just to see where it would take me. But I didn't go through the process because I was going to go with my polling book. But we did get an email encouraging us to vote. Now, I will say, and offering us the ability through the military to vote, by the way, not just hey, you really need to get to the poll, but as a member of the military, we will help you do this. Now, I will say this too, that's the first time in 5 years, well then in 4 years, the first time that I'd ever received an email saying, hey, we really want you guys to vote. So that was a little bit telling.
No, that's why I think it's always be fair when you can be fair. If they're doing something right, bring that up as well. So, but when they're not, let them have it, right? Just kidding. So, man, you guys have been incredible. I was telling Mary earlier, I felt a little bit rusty because it's been a long time since I've been able to talk about this. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and your patience this afternoon. And again, thank you for taking time to come here and be here today. And let's keep moving forward and working together. Thank you.